We're going to move on to verse 7, or looking at verse 7. Then one of the 4 living creatures gave to the 7 angels 7 golden bowls full of the wrath of God. How can this be read as anything other than coming from the hand of God? Here I want to point out the picture from the remedy. I don't know, maybe if you've got it on your devices or bricks and mortar version of it. I'm just going to review some of the descriptions of the 7 bowls and just see if you're drawn to this like I am. By each verse, chapter 15, verse 7, the 7 gold bowls filled with the heartbreaking disengagement of God, who is the source of all life. The gold bowls are symbolic of God's stepwise release of those who would choose to be separate from Him. Then in verse 8, the final 7-step release of God's restraint. Chapter 16, verse 1, the 7 bowls of God's heartbreaking disengagement upon the earth. Verse 2, symbolizing God's love, granting people their final choice of rejecting Him and allowing them to reap the consequences of their choice by no longer shielding them from with His protective hand. Chapter 16, verses 3, 4, 8, and 10 for the subsequent plagues, symbolizing the withdrawing of God's protective and life-sustaining presence from the earth. Verse 12, symbolizing the withdrawing of God's forces of righteousness. And lastly, in verse 17, symbolizing God's restraining and protective presence being completely removed from the earth. And when you read Revelation and you read that repetition, it's like it's getting bad. No, okay, I can breathe and I can take the next one. And then because it resets your mind for why and the purpose, or maybe giving us more insight as to why things are happening the way they are. In Sunday, the first paragraph says, people have already made their choice, either for God or for Babylon. Before Christ comes, however, the destructive winds of Satan's fury that have been restrained are unleashed, followed by the 7 last plagues. Can we review that imagery involved in the 4 angels releasing the winds of strife? This is found in Revelation 7, verses 1 through 3. If someone would read verse 1, Revelation 7, verse 1.
And after these things I saw 4 angels standing on the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth, that the wind should not blow on the earth, nor on the sea, nor on any tree.
So what are the 4 angels doing? Holding back the winds of strife. The forces of evil, satanic agencies, and thus their power to harm the earth is by letting go their hold, just like God let Satan loose in the book of Job. Ellen White supports these views, and I'll include these quotes. I think I'll skip over reading them right now. And in fact, the content of our Sunday draws the analogy of the 7 plagues with the 10 plagues in Egypt. And I'd like to skip over that unless somebody has a problem with that, because that comparison to me is a weak analogy. It's vaguely repetitive and incomplete alignment between the 7 last plagues and the 10 plagues upon Egypt. And secondly, as I understand them, the plagues of Egypt were delivered at God's hand, whereas the 7 last plagues were not. Later, I'd like to demonstrate the comparison of the last plagues with the trumpets, the trumpet sequence, and then ask yourself, as I did, why would the quarterly not be making that more obvious correlation or comparison, instead looking at Egypt? I think that might have something to do with the forces behind the plagues. Continue on Sunday's lesson, paragraph 2. We touched on this before. The 7 last plagues are referred to as the last plagues because they come at the very end of Earth's history, and maybe to contrast to the first plagues and the trumpets and the seals. Last, in that with them God's wrath, His letting go, is complete. The remedy in chapter 15, verse 2 says, last, because when these are released, God will have ceased all intercession on earth. The third paragraph, Eve, if you wouldn't mind preparing for, she shared with me her definition of something that I'm lifting from the quarterly that states, divine wrath is God's righteous judgment on the choices people have made. And would you share your translation?
Yeah. I said that God lets go of those who have rejected him, leaving them to the consequences of their own choices. His righteous judgment is simply an accurate diagnosis.
And it's easy when I read the Sabbath School Quarterly, it's so easy to go, like, you just get in this, yeah, okay. It's so easy to go back into that, the groove that says yes, that reaffirms maybe what we've been taught or what seems to be the predominant way of viewing God's wrath. All the more reason to flood our minds with this picture of God. On Monday, I'm going to share that I'm a member at the library Sabbath School class at the big church, and I taught the week of the trumpets to less than grand fanfare. I dissented with the quarterly's position that the trumpet plagues were, again, divine judgments of retribution, punitive judgments, another quote, and or covenant curses, as described by its authors. Instead, I hold that the plagues were delivered by the adversary. They have his fingerprints all over them. And while the vast majority of Christianity agrees with the Sabbath School author's conclusions, I'm holding out. Based on what I know to be true about God, he just cannot be saying all along, all I want from you is your love and trust, only to, in the end, say, or I'm going to have to kill you. If I can, I'd like to just review, go through the trumpets and the bowls, just to kind of impress upon you how obvious this comparison was, but this was not brought out in the Sabbath School Quarterly.